MLB Kids Rule, and this should be the last video, part 5 of the series for explaining how I made the Sudoku game that I had demoed, I don't know, probably a couple months ago. So, hopefully this should be the last video. There's only a little bit more to cover, if I remember correctly. And so if you have not watched the earlier, I posted 3 demos, the initial version, an updated version, and then kind of a teaser of trying to switch this over to icons instead of numbers. I would watch I guess the second demo. It's not the most update version of this because I did add some things towards the end, bug fixed and things like that. But I would watch the demo to get an idea of how this is supposed to work. And then you really should watch parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, even if you just skim through them, because that will give you an idea of where we are up to this point. First, let me get my caveat out of the way. I am not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert. I am still learning RPG Maker MZ. I have no previous experience with any version of RPG Maker or any sort of game developing or programming or anything like that. I am also trying to learn JavaScript through an online course, because I found that is helpful. So these tutorials are just, they're not necessarily the best way to do something. They're not necessarily the most efficient way to do something, but they are ways that I have achieved something. I have built something that works to all of the testing that I've done with it. And the sole purpose of doing this is that if this helps somebody on their journey, like other people have helped me with their tutorials, then this is all worthwhile. So again, where the first 4 parts of this basically covered all the behind scene stuff, all the switches, all the variables, all the common events, talked about how the puzzle works, and talked in detail about each one of these squares and things like that of the puzzle. And started with this puzzle switch event, which is what starts the whole process. And we've, over the course of 2 tutorials, finished that entire event. Also highlighted the puzzle setup and the solve puzzle events. Those were completely, went through them all completely over multiple tutorials. And in the last tutorial, went through the player chooses hints event, so finished that up. So these 4 events, best of my recollection, gone through all 4 of these events, all the pages. And at some point in time in these events, these other 3 events are being triggered. They are running in parallel. So a lot of the events in this, to make this game work, a lot of these events run in parallel. So the events are doing, they're doing different things all at the same time. So I'm going to highlight these last 3 events, and it will also highlight the last common event that we haven't talked about yet. And then we'll just double check to make sure everything was covered. So as in the previous videos, I showed where these are being triggered. All of these are being turned on through that script that allows you to turn self switches on or off in any map, on any map, in any event, right? Any of the self switches A, B, C, or D. So let's just look at what the reset is doing, right? So it says reset test, but that's just because I was testing the functionality. So essentially what this event is doing is it presents a reset button down here at the bottom that the player can click at any time once it becomes active to essentially reset everything, start over again. So essentially give up on the puzzle. And how does it work? Well, it does have a self switch A as its the condition on the first page. It is set to run in parallel, but it won't run until this switch is turned on somewhere. It has to be turned on by one of these events remotely. And you notice there's no imagery, right? So the player cannot see it on the map. It's below characters, so the player could walk on it in theory if it's someplace where the player can walk. And it is set to run parallel as soon as this switch is turned on. When this switch gets turned on, the first thing it does is it uses the show picture command. This is picture 94. Remember, I said in another tutorial, another part of this series, I think I used pretty much all 99 pictures for this game. And in default MZ, I think you can use 99 pictures. You can't, I don't think you can go more than that without a plugin of some sort. So this is just making a white box appear down here where we can insert the words reset. So show picture, picture 94, it's a white box. And this you just have to figure out the pixels, the X and Y coordinate. And I had to figure out the scale, right? So because I'm using just this white box that I'm using for these squares, and so I wanted to make it wider, right? So that it would look like a rectangle. And you can easily do that once you have the starting thing. And you just have to mess around with the X and Y to figure out where you want it to show on the screen. So once the event puts that box on the screen, we then use that command, that plugin. We use the plugin TextPicture, which I've highlighted a bunch of times, and the text that it's being that's going to display is reset game. And /C and the number 15, that just changes the color of the text from the normal white text. It changes it. And this plugin requires a show picture afterwards, picture 95, with no image because the text is the image. And again, you have to just mess around with the X and Y to make sure it shows up where you want it to show up within that white box. So first thing it does, draw a white rectangle at the bottom. On top of that, uh, display the reset game letters. Okay, the words reset game. Also, make that reset game clickable. So you notice that this is the other plugin, ButtonPicture. You notice the picture is 95, so that's actually the words reset game, not the white box. So you have to pick the picture that you want, and then it calls common event 239, and we'll go look at that in just a minute. Common event 239 is very similar to when you reset the puzzle using the puzzle switch. We went over that page of that event where you can flip that switch again after, say, you finish the puzzle and solve it, and it resets essentially. It resets everything. That's what this common event is going to do. So we'll show that. Then it waits 10 frames because, again, if you're going to have a parallel event running, you don't want it doing all of this 60 times a second, right? So a simple wait of 10 frames. Remember, there's 60 frames in 1 second. So it just, basically it doesn't, it saves a little bit of processing on the engine and your computer. And then it just keeps doing this over and over again. And what is it doing? It's waiting for the player to click on the reset. If the player never clicks on it, no big deal, right? It just sits there and does its thing. It's circling, going through this and over again, waiting for the player to click on that reset game, which will trigger 239. At some point in time, the second page gets triggered, meaning that one of these events uses the script to make self switch B active, right? Turn it on, and that will trigger this page to be the highest page where the conditions are met. And just like I highlighted before, there's no contents, it's an action button. Essentially, it just stops this from running in parallel. And now it doesn't have anything else to do, right? It's just sitting there waiting for the whole thing to be reset. So that's what this event is doing. Okay, very simple, not too much. Draw a rectangle white box, put some text on top of it, make that text clickable, and call common event 239. So let's go look at common event 239. So we'll go here, common events, and we already went through all these events, right? We already went through all of these events in the first tutorial, I'm pretty sure. Talked about exactly what they're doing. And we went through this event, this common event, Sudoku solve puzzle. We went through this and how it checks to see are there any errors in any of the columns, any of the rows, or any of the groups. And now this is the common event 239, Sudoku puzzle reset. And this is very, very similar. Okay, if you take a little look at this, where this is basically turning all of the self switches off, and then it's turning all of the regular switches off, and it's resetting all of the variables to zero. That should look very familiar because it should look very familiar to what this page is doing. So puzzle switch, page 2, this page is basically doing something very, very similar. Not all of it. It's not doing the whole thing because it doesn't need to do the same things as the reset test does. Because this is usually pretty much it's only able to be used, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back and double check, but I think this is only being used when somebody successfully solves the puzzle. And when you successfully solve the puzzle, part of that is common event 240, and 240 is where once it goes through all of its checks, and then it gets down here, it is in fact turning some self switches to true, meaning it's moving them onto those inactive pages, the ones where there's no contents. But it's turning off, right, the puzzles. It's setting all the variables to zero. It's turning off all the switches, right? So it's doing something very, very similar. So, whoops, sorry. So 239. When the player selects the reset and it triggers this common event. First thing it does is it does confirmation text. Are you sure you want to give up and reset the game, right? So I don't want someone clicking on that box down there by mistake and then resetting the whole puzzle, right? So we're going to ask for confirmation. Show choices yes and no. When yes, it's going to do a whole bunch of stuff. When no, it's just going to exit the event. So it's like you didn't even click it. And then that reset test is still circling in the background, waiting in parallel, right? Waiting for that reset button to be clicked again. If you say, yes, I do want to reset the puzzle, first thing it does is it stops the control timer. Now that's being controlled over here by this event. Okay, so there is a timer and a control timer event, and you can either start it or stop it, and you can set the time. We'll see that get turned on. If I just go here, let's see, that's on page 2 maybe. I don't use this one very often. Or is it page 3? Or did I miss it? Let's go back here. So let's see, show endpoint. Oh, here we go, control timer, sorry. So right underneath the variables and self switches, control timer, you can start it, stop it, you can set how much time. Okay, there's not a lot of things that you can, not a lot of different things you can do with this as far as options go. So it's going to stop the timer, which was started by this event over here. Then what it's going to do is, again, like I highlighted in resetting the switch, it's going to essentially turn all of the switches, all of these self switches in all of these events off. It's turning them all to false, turning them all off, as if none of the events had been interacted with. So as you can see here, I did one script for each event. So this one is turning off all of the pages, self switch C, B, and A on event 2. This one is turning off the 2 self switches for event 1. This one's turning off the 4 self switches for event 4. This one is turning off the 2 self switches for event 5. This one, it's basically just turning off one self switch for event 3, which is the puzzle switch. And then this one, it's actually doing two events. So it's turning off the 4 self switches for event 6 and then the 2 self switches for event 7. And we've already looked at this. We've already looked at how this works. You can, with a script command, you can put a whole bunch of stuff in here. I already mentioned how you can copy one line, paste it, and then just change the necessary values, right? So all of this is basically just turning off all the self switches as if these events were never interacted with. Okay? Then again, we've got to reset this whole thing as if we've never started the game. So we're going to take all of the switches, so control switches, there's two, because there's a gap in between here. There's a 174 that is not used. So it's going to turn off all of these switches and then turn off all these switches. And I highlighted this in another tutorial. This is something. This is the only time that I've used this functionality where you can do a range, right? You can set a range of switches to turn on or off. And then same thing with the variables, right? This is a range of variables being set to 0. And this is the first time in this Sudoku game that I've ever used that, where I've had a need to set a whole bunch of variables to the same value. And this is really cool. I'm really happy that this is like that. I'm sure there's probably a scripting way to do it, but I don't know what it is. I haven't learned enough about JavaScript to make that work. So these are turning off all of the switches that are being used in the Sudoku game. And these three things are setting all of the variables that are being used in this Sudoku game to 0, as if we haven't really interacted with the game yet. I highlighted this before. This is the script to clear all pictures off of the screen. So, if even if we had all of our pictures on the screen at the same time, we had, pretty much 99 pictures, this is going to clear them all. Now, this is putting the one picture back on the screen. I highlighted this in another tutorial, earlier part of this tutorial series, because I don't want to erase these pictures one at a time, and so I just clear them all, and then immediately put the score back on the screen down here. So text picture, the text is score using the variable 718. You notice that 718 is not being reset here. So 715 to 717 is set to 0. We skip 718 because that's the score, and then we do 719 to 720. So I'm not resetting the score because I want the player to keep the score if they had a previous score value. And then of course show picture is making it appear on the screen. So this clears all the pictures. This and this puts this particular one back on the screen, and you don't even notice it in the game, quite frankly. It happens so fast that you don't even notice that this was gone. And then this is setting the player free, where we're setting that movement route. We're setting that movement route of the player, no movement commands, no repeat or anything, no wait. And once it's done, that means the player can move again. So as I previously highlighted. And that's the end of this particular common event. So it's pretty simple. If somebody clicks the reset button, it calls this common event, asks for confirmation, yes or no. When yes, it's going to stop the timer. It's going to turn all the self switches off of all the events to make sure that none of them are active, none of them are running, none of them are doing any parallel event processes. It's going to turn off the switches. It's going to turn on. It's going to basically set all the variables back to 0 except for the score. It clears all the pictures, and then it puts the score back on the screen, sets the player free so the player can move around, right? And when no, it exits the event processing. So once the player's free, the player can walk along here again, and then initiate this again if they want to play again. Okay, so that's the reset test event. Not too bad. Timer control. Again, I added the feature for reset, the feature for timer, and the feature for score and penalty. I added that after I did all the puzzle part, and then I was like, I just want to keep, if it was a game, if I was going to make this a game, there should be some other features to it. So the timer control event isn't really that complicated. I did have to experiment a little bit to figure out how the timer works because I don't use the timer very often. So once again, the first page of this event is set to run in parallel. There's no image, the player can't see it. Below characters, player could walk on it, if it's reachable. And first page has self switch A. So again, one of these events over here is turning this event on because it's turning on self switch A, which makes this event start to run in parallel. What does it do when it starts to run in parallel? Well, first thing it does is it takes the variable 719 Sudoku timer counter and sets it to 600. Why? Because the timer is going to be set for 10 minutes. And essentially, 60 seconds times 10 is 600 minutes. So the way I set this up was that once the timer starts, this variable is going to start counting down. Every second that goes by, a number goes away from here. So it goes from 600 to 599 to 598 to 597. And while it is a positive number, it is considered to be a bonus. So if you solve the puzzle before the timer runs out, you would get a bonus to your score. And then there's the opposite would happen if the timer runs out, then you start accruing a penalty that would go against your score. And then it turns on its own self switch B. So it sets this variable to 600, so we can have something that is going to be reduced by 1 every second, so it can be used as a bonus. And then it sets the timer. It starts the timer, and the timer appears at the top of the screen, and it starts counting down from 10 minutes. And then it turns its own self switch B on, which changes the page to here, which is also set to run in parallel, meaning that this content immediately starts to run. Self switch B, right? No image, below characters. So what is this page doing? Well, first thing it does is it starts going through, starts cycling through these checks. First thing, conditional branch. If the timer is less than or equal to 0 minutes, 0 seconds, that means the timer has run out, then stop the timer. So turn the timer off, so the timer should disappear, and turn self switch C on, so you can advance the page. If that's not true, so basically you notice there's no else branch here, there doesn't have to be. If there's still time on the timer, then this isn't going to happen. Instead, it's going to do the next check. If puzzle solved is on, because this timer is going to be running. It's going to be running in the background essentially. And then if the player uses the solve puzzle feature, clicks on the little question mark and it checks the puzzle. Well, if the puzzle is solved, right? If there's no errors like we talked about in the solve puzzle and then the comment event for solving the puzzle, if there's no error, then you did it right. You got the solution right. It's going to turn on the switch puzzle solved. And so this event is using that switch to say, hey, if the puzzle solve switch gets turned on, that means the player solved it correctly, I'm going to stop the timer. I'm going to stop it wherever it was, and I'm going to turn on self switch D. So I'm going to skip over page 3, and I'm going to go directly to page 4. If this is not true, and this is not true, then all this event is doing is it subtracts 1 from that Sudoku timer counter. So which starts at 600, it subtracts 1, so it goes to 599, waits 1 second, and then it checks again. So this is what makes this thing go down once every second. And you can use this type of concept anytime you want to have passage of time in a game. Let's say you wanted to have passage of time for something to respawn, or passage of time for an NPC to appear, or passage of time for a day-night system or something. This is one way. This is a concept that you can use to do that. So it subtracts one from this variable, waits 60 frames, waits 1 second, and then checks everything again, and then checks everything again, and checks everything again, until either this is true and it turns on self switch C and it moves to page 3, or this is true and it turns on self switch D and moves to page 4. Okay, so this will just keep running, counting down. All right. Um, Now, and this is fine, because if the timer runs out, then this will basically essentially be either 0 or 1. Yeah, I'd have to play around with it to see exactly what it would be, but it is not going to matter. So if the timer runs out, it's going to advance. Or if you solve the puzzle before the timer runs out, it'll advance. Okay, so now what does page 3 do? Page 3 is it picks up the penalty. So here, the timer runs out. Stop the timer, turn on self switch C. That makes this page active. This is now the highest page where the conditions are met. Self switch C. No image, below characters, running in parallel. So it's still running by itself. It picks right up. First thing it does is it checks this conditional branch. If puzzle solved is on, then just turn on self switch D and go to the next page. Otherwise, we're going to use this variable, 720, Sudoku penalty counter, which is going to start at 0. So we're going to add 1 to it. We're going to wait 60 frames, 1 second, and then it's going to check this again. Okay, so it checks, is it solved? Nope, not solved. I'm going to add 1 more to the penalty counter, wait 60 frames, wait 1 second, and check it again. So this is how our penalty accrues if you don't solve the puzzle in the amount of time that's necessary. Eventually, we should get to self switch D, right? So this is just, again, empty contents. Action button, so nothing's running in parallel. Self switch D, so this is how you basically turn this event off, right? You're at a page where there's nothing else going to happen. Okay, so not too bad. Page 1 sets this to 600, starts the timer, moves itself forward, then it starts doing its check. Has the timer run out? If so, stop it, move to the next page. If the puzzle's been solved, stop the timer, move to page D. Otherwise, we're going to subtract 1 from our timer counter, wait 60 frames for 1 second, and then check it all again. We could move to this page, right, if the timer runs out, in which case, again, still running in parallel, it's gonna check, is the puzzle solved? If so, if that switch gets turned on, jump to page 4. Otherwise, add 1 to the penalty counter variable, wait 60 frames, 1 second, then check again, and check again, check again. And then this one is just, of course, no contents, nothing's being run, action button not running in parallel. Okay? Now, I should mention this. Obviously, for experimenting purposes, I just randomly determined this to be 10 minutes. If you were recreating this game, you would have to figure out what is a reasonable time that you would expect the player to finish a puzzle and therefore accumulate points, right? Because remember, once the timer runs out, the way I built this, there's a penalty. Right now, you could build this game without a timer. You could build this game without a score and penalty. You could do that. But this is just an option. The other thing I would say is that there are 3 different puzzles, easy, medium, and hard. And then, of course, you have the added complexity of picking your own hints. So having only 1 timer is probably not realistic. That's probably not good. And so what you would want to do is you would want to figure out what would be a good time for the easy puzzle, what would be a good time for the medium puzzle, what would be a good time for the hard puzzle, and then maybe try to figure out what would be a good time for choosing your own hints or not. And then you would have to build that in. You would have to modify this so that, if you pick puzzle 1, you're going to be, say, on the 10-minute timer. If you picked puzzle 2, you might be on a 12-minute timer, right? Or a 15-minute timer. If you pick puzzle 3, you might be on a 20-minute timer, right? Or an 18-minute timer, something like that. And then, of course, you can manipulate the variables here and that sort of thing. So that's just one thing to think about, right? This is just experimenting to see how the functionality works. This is not really game ready. Let's put it that way. You'd need to figure this out and maybe have different timers for different puzzles. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to mention. So we talked about the reset test, or basically the reset functionality. We talked about the timer functionality. Now the last event is the score and penalty. Again, I just added this towards the end as an option, trying to figure out how would this work if I wanted to put this as part of a game, right? A game, not just a Sudoku puzzle. So again, this is a parallel event. It's not running when the map loads because the self switch is not turned on. So once again, this self switch A, gets turned on by one of these other events. When it does, remember, no image, player can't see it. Below characters, player can walk on it if it's applicable. Once this self switch gets turned on, it starts to run in parallel with some of these other things running. And so what is it doing? Well, first thing is if the score is, well, the first time this gets activated, the score is not displayed on the screen, right? So up to this point, when you start playing the game, when this gets activated, it's the first time the score gets displayed on the screen. So this was pretty much the same thing as what we saw under, I think, the reset option. So, when we cleared the pictures and then put this back on, this is the first time it actually happened. So we use the plugin command, TextPicture, score, the variable 718. We use the show picture 92. Tell it where to go. It's basically down here in the corner. And so these two things display that score and the value of the variable, which in the beginning it's set to 0 because that's just the way I did it, right? You could set it at an initial score of 500 if you wanted to. You just have to do that at some place where it's not going to be repeated and reset to 500. So that would be up to you. Then what does it do? Well, first thing it does is it checks itself and says, if, conditional branch, the timer is greater than or equal to 0, meaning the timer is running. So if the timer is running, then it's going to show this possible bonus. And this is showing up down here in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And again, this is the first time this pops up. So we use that plugin command, text picture. What is the text? Possible bonus. The variable is 719. And then we use show picture, picture 91, and we figure out where to place it. You notice that 588 and 588 are the same. That's how far down, right? How far down it is, because the y coordinate goes down. And then the x coordinate, the 12 and the 4, I'm sorry, the 12 and 468, that's how far across it is, right? So this is, for the first time, making on the screen appear the possible bonus. And then there's an else condition, right? So if the timer is above 0, if the timer's running, do this. Otherwise, else, it's going to convert that text from a possible bonus to a time penalty. And then it's going to be a different variable, 720. We saw that over on the timer controller. And then the picture is still 91 because it's appearing in the same spot, so we can reuse that picture, right? So possible bonus, picture 91. When it changes to time penalty, it can still be picture 91 because those two things are never going to show up on the screen at the same time. And the location is the same, 468, 468, 588, 588. Okay, so that's what this is doing. It's first thing it puts the score down here, then it puts that message over here about the bonus or the time penalty. And we already saw over here on the timer controller, these are being updated every second when they're applicable, right? And this running in parallel will keep those updated, right? It'll keep those updated. So then the next thing it does, it has a conditional branch to check. Is the puzzle solved? So if puzzle solved switch is on, then you're going to do something. Okay. And is there an else branch? No, there's not. Okay. So this conditional statement here does not have an else branch. The else belongs to this one. So if the puzzle solved is on, and if the timer is greater than 0, so the timer is still running, then we're going to take this variable Sudoku score, right, which is being updated up here and is showing down here. We're going to take that Sudoku score and we're going to add the Sudoku timer counter, right, which is essentially our bonus. Okay, and you guys should know how to do this. So variable, add variable, right? Then it's going to basically update that picture down here, right? Because we want it updated. We are not, if this is happening, if the puzzle's solved, we're not going to go back up here to the event. So the score won't get updated on the screen unless we do it right here. So that's what we're doing. We're updating that score to show the new score. And the picture is the same, the location is the same, right? So 1258, 588, picture 92, right? So that's the same. Else, meaning that if the timer has expired, you solve the puzzle, but the timer's expired, then it's going to take the Sudoku score, okay, and subtract the penalty counter. So it's basically doing the opposite as this one's doing. And then it has to update that score. So it can update the score on the screen. So these are basically copy and pasted. These are basically copy and pasted from up here, right? Once it's done that, so if the puzzle solved is on, it's going to do one of these two things. If there's still timer, it's going to increase the score and update it. If the timer is expired, it's going to decrease the score and update it on the screen. Then it's going to turn on its own self switch B. Okay, so it advances the page. But if this is not true, if the puzzle solved is not on, it's just going to wait 10 frames and go back up to the top and check everything again. So it goes up here, makes sure that the score is updated, checks the timer, right? Does this particular thing. If the timer is still running, do this. Otherwise, do this. Checks to see if the puzzle's solved, right? And if the puzzle's solved, do these things. If the puzzle is not solved, then wait 10 frames and check again. So again, parallel event, this just keeps running over and over and over again until this switch gets turned on. Puzzle solved gets turned on. Or the player presses the reset button, in which case when they press the reset button, all of these self switches get turned off, which basically deactivates this event, right? Because then nothing will be running if the switch is turned off. Okay, so that's what page 1 does. Page 2, again, is that blank page. There's no contents. It's an action button, so it's not running in parallel, and it's just sitting there, right? So we've seen that from the other events that have this same concept, where the highest page is just empty. So it basically stops running in parallel. Okay, and that's what it does here, right? If the puzzle's solved, it does this one last time, it turns this on, and then it stops doing anything, right? It just sits there waiting for everything to be reset. Okay, So I believe that's everything now. I think we've covered everything. So, um, once again, I guess I'll just highlight really quickly. If you don't need the highlight, I mean, I guess now is where you could kind of bag off. But um, you know, in previously we went through all of these common events. These basically you write the common event once and then you copy and paste it and update it 80 times, right? And these are the common events that are associated with each of these squares. And though this is the stuff doing the work that says, hey, if the Sudoku hint selection is on, then basically I'm identifying this as a hint, right? I'm turning the hint switch on, right? And I'm counting that you made a selection. And then another part of the event is essentially identifying this as a hint and displaying it on the screen. Otherwise, if the player is not making hints, is not selecting hints, then it allows this input number, allows the player to input a number from 0 to 9. And each one of them has a variable, right? And it turns off the puzzle error because we talked about that already. It shows the variable value in the square in the appropriate spot, and then it basically does this check of if the variable is not equal to 0, then basically that switch Sudoku 1-1 is on, which tells another event that it needs to display a value of the variable, versus if it is 0, it tells the other event that it should be a white box, right? And we saw all that functionality. So this is just, you make one, then you copy it, paste it, change the name, update the necessary values, and you just do that 80 times. Again, I worked on this for a long time, a little bit at a time, but pay very close attention. Double check your work. Double check your work. Because when I was building this, I had the luxury of building it in pieces and I could test it as I built it. If you're trying to follow along with this tutorial, you're building it not necessarily in testable pieces. So it might be a little bit harder to do testing to double check that you didn't make any mistakes. And then we already highlighted the reset. We highlighted the solve puzzle. We highlighted all the stuff that's doing. And we went through the puzzle switch, which actually activates the event, lets the player choose puzzle one, puzzle two, puzzle three, or choose my own hints. And we talked about this page, which essentially is resetting everything. So you can reset the game, if you will, with this functionality. And we went through this event, the puzzle setup. We went through all the stuff that it's doing. And again, we basically talked about the fact that it's a lot of copying and pasting. And this is the one where this is the same for every single square, right? But then there's also this, if puzzle one is on, you have to account for the hint in puzzle one, or puzzle two, or puzzle three, right? So we went through all that. And it's just a lot of repeated stuff. And whoops, and we highlighted this page that basically shuts everything off. We highlighted what the solve puzzle does, right? Gives the player a bunch of instructions and activates some events over here, and then it does its checking here, right? Solve puzzle. This is basically setting up the functionality where the player can click on an icon to try to solve the puzzle and call common event 240. And then we have here where you're shutting the page down. And we went through this one where if the player is going to choose their own hints, we talked about what page one is doing. It's setting up the solution for each puzzle. And then we talked about this one where the player is basically selecting their choices. And then once they finish, it's going to set all of the non-hints back to 0, and then eventually it gets down here to doing its check, while this is what's running while the player still has choices to make, right? And then eventually we went to page 3, and this is the page that's running while the player is selecting boxes and inputting values and basically playing the game. And then we talked about this, which is shutting that event down. And then we just talked about the reset event and what each one of these pages is for. And we talked about the common event for basically resetting everything. We talked about the timer control, and we went over each of these pages and what they're doing, right? So this one is basically starting the timer. This one is basically checking to see if the timer's still running or if the puzzle's solved, and it's basically reducing that timer counter variable. This one is accumulating a penalty, right? If the puzzle's not solved and if the timer's off, and then this shuts everything down. And then we went through the score and penalty. Okay. Um, I don't think there's anything else. I think I covered everything. So I already showed you that how this map was made. I showed you that these are essentially part of the map, right? Because that seemed easier to me. If I use the mapping functionality to make the puzzle, and then I could draw my white squares and I could put my numbers in the middle of these squares. That just seemed much easier. So these are part of the map. Um, you don't have to do this switchy thing, right? You could, in theory, make this game with no sprite, right? You could make it where when the game loads up, it just automatically loads up something that looks like a Sudoku puzzle, and the player is given choices, right? And you could change this easily. This is just the initial way I started. I started down this path, and I haven't made any changes to that effect. If I were to ever decide to make this just a Sudoku game, right? Just to say, hey, I finished a game, I would definitely not have a sprite present. I would not have a switch. I would just have it. The game loads up, you start the game, and then I would have to figure out my menus, right? What do I want to do first? Do I show them the rules first? Do I let them select a puzzle first? How do I want to do that? But I would definitely not do it like a character sprite type inside of a game. Um, and that's pretty much it. So the only thing that I would also mention is something I just thought of earlier today. Haven't tested it yet. I might do that. I might test this. This is just something for you to think about if you decide you want to try to build this and expand upon it and make it better, right? And that is the idea that you instead of remember how here I I said that I took a puzzle and I used the solution of the puzzle to essentially identify what all of these squares are supposed to be, and then that way I know it is a solvable puzzle from the beginning. I know that for a fact. And then the player can choose their own hints, and then whichever of these isn't a hint, it gets zeroed out, and then the player proceeds. Here's an idea to think about. I don't know why I didn't think of this before. I really think I want to try this. You could make it where instead of doing this and having these values predetermined so that when the player clicks on it, this is always going to be a 6. If the player clicks on this, it's always going to be a 2. Instead of doing that, you could change it where the game is checking to see if I select this square here. If it's the first one I'm selecting, fine. It's whatever number. It can be a random number. It can be a randomly determined number. If I then select this one, the game would check and say, have I already selected a hint in this row? If the answer is yes, then this one can't repeat what I've already selected. And you can do this through you could use this through arrays, for instance. So you could set up arrays, which we already talked about. Each one of these, there's an array for all the rows, all the columns, all the groups. You could set up an array where each array has the numbers 1 through 9 in it. And when you selected, let's say the player randomly selects this square, what it would do is it would randomly identify a number, assign it to this variable, and then it would have to remove that number from the array for this column, the array for this column, this row, and the array for this group. And then when the player picks another box, say they pick here, then what it would have to do is it would select from that array, right, randomly, and then just remove it from the array for this column, this row, and this group. And then if I picked another number in the same, for instance here, so this is the same column, same group, it would have to basically check to make sure that whatever number is being randomly determined is not a repeat, right, from this group and from this column. And so that's just something I was thinking about. I haven't fully flushed it out yet, but the reason I was thinking about it was, could you make it where there is no solved puzzle behind the scenes? And essentially the game is randomly deciding the hints when you click on them. So I click here, it randomly determines a number to give me. I click here, it randomly determines a number to give me, but it makes sure that it's not a duplicate of this one, because it can't be. And if I pick here, it's going to randomly give me a number, but it's going to make sure it's not a duplicate of this one, because it can't be. And the value of doing that, if you haven't realized it yet, is that if you could make that work, then you wouldn't have to pre-program any puzzles. You could basically make it where the player chooses their own hints, and as long as the hints don't conflict with each other, the puzzle should be solvable from that point on. Or you could make it where this would be even harder. You could make it where the hints are randomly placed and they're not conflicting with each other, and then the player has to then solve that. Now, the danger with that is if the hints are randomly placed, unless you did some stuff behind the scene to make sure that they were kind of spread out, it's possible that you could create a puzzle that would be very, very hard to solve, except through trial and error, right? That could be a problem. But anyway, that's just an idea I thought of. Haven't invested any time in doing it, but I'm thinking I might. I'm thinking I might, because that might expand some possibilities for making this a standalone game, where I can say, hey, I finished a game, and because it's pretty far down on the path now. All right. Anyway, enough rambling. This finishes the series. This finishes the 5 parts. I think I covered everything. If you diligently go through this and you discover that I did not cover something, if you notice that I didn't talk about all the contents of a page of an event, or I didn't cover all the pages of an event, by all means, let me know, and I will do an amended version. I'll do another part to make sure I talk about it. Other than that, folks, this wraps this up. Took me a long time to make, and took me a long time to make these tutorials. I hope it helps somebody. There are some concepts in here that are definitely usable for a lot of other things, and I'm going to make sure that I keep track of these, because I kind of forgot some of this stuff. I'm going to make sure I keep track of these so I can use some of these concepts myself in some of my other experiments. I hope this is helpful. I'm glad you found my channel. If you did watch through these completely, then bless your heart. You have a lot of patience. If you do try to recreate this, I'd love to hear how it worked out for you. And if you improve upon it, if you make it better, etc., whatever, and make it more efficient, add features, cool. I'd love to hear that too. Um, you can find me on rpgmakerweb.com in the forums. My username over there is Zombie Kids Rule, so same as here. And if these are helpful, if you appreciate the time that goes into them, please consider liking, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments. And I'm gonna wrap this up now. It's been a long week. I've done a lot of videos. Think I'm running out of time now. I don't think I'm going to be able to do much more. But again, I really hope this helps people. I hope you are having a great time learning RPG Maker. Hope you're having a great time working on your projects. And I wish you the best of luck. I hope everyone's having a great day. And I don't know when I'll get another video up, but until that time, I just want to wish everybody, happy gaming, happy game developing, and I will talk to everybody later. Bye.